Today is December 7th, 2023. I'm Cameron Wood here at the Ohio History Center in Columbus, Ohio. With me is Donald Laufersweiler, and we are going to talk about his history of psychotherapy in Columbus. Mr. Laufersweiler, can you please say and spell your name for me?
Sure, it's Don Laufersweiler, Laufersweiler.
Thank you.
Yep.
Where and when were you born?
I was born here in Columbus, 1950, May 11th, 1950 at 10:10 a.m. And at St. Anne's Hospital on Bryden Road.
What was it like growing up in Columbus?
It was fairly reasonable. I mean, my family I had 11 brothers and sisters total. I was number 8. So there was always a group around, and my brothers and sisters were all very connected to their groups, and so there was always a lot of people around. And I just remember from early on always having the neighborhood around. Mm-hmm. So it was pretty decent. We were in what now would be, I guess, Old Town East, that's my mother was born in that neighborhood, and my dad was also from Columbus up north in Clintonville. Mm-hmm. So we always had a family around.
And what did they do for work?
My mother was a housekeeper, and obviously with 11 children, eventually she didn't have time for much more than that. And Dad was a salesman and a executive for Kinnear Corporation, which was a door company. Overhead doors, dam locks, large industrial doors. And that was located, the home office was here in Columbus, on Fields Avenue, right down the road.
Oh yeah, just south of here then.
Yep.
Is it still around?
No, it closed up. It was family owned. And it closed, I'm going to say somewhere around 1980. Between 80 and 90, it kind of disappeared. Mm-hmm. Just a lot of competition, and everything was handmade there for the most part. It was a labor-intensive door-making situation. Yeah. So Kinnear was, at the time, the only laboratory underwritten door in the world, which means the fire doors were all had special certifications and stuff, and but it just couldn't keep up with competition.
Right. Yeah, we've moved away from that type of manufacturing
right. Yeah. I mean, it had its own foundry and it made its own little tiny parts and everything. I worked there for a while in summers.
Does your family have a long history in Columbus?
Actually, yes. The Laufersweiler side, I had my great-grandfather had a grocery store, and my great-great-grandmother had a millinery made hats and had a clothing store. And it was on Friend Street, which is now Main Street. Down, I guess it would have been in the what's the downtown area now. Mm-hmm. And it was just Laufersweiler's Grocery and Meats, I think is what it was called. And then on the other side is my grandmother's last name is Wittenmeyer, and my great-grandfather on that side had one of the first quarries in Franklin County, and he and his brother Frederick Wittenmeyer and Jacob Wittenmeyer, they built the Ohio Penitentiary. Their stone was used to build the Ohio Penitentiary and the annex to the state capitol. So yeah, we've been around here since the 1800s. I think that pretty much they settled here. the Wittenmeyers settled in Chicago first, I think, and then ended up here in Columbus. But the Laufersweilers, best I can tell, came directly from, well, no, they started in in Minster, Ohio, in St. Mary's area, and then ended up coming towards Dayton and Columbus.
Right. So not far away, though.
Right.
What was Old Town East like when you were growing up?
Well, that was before the interstates came through. So it was, it was just what you would consider a typical, I would say, middle-class neighborhood. If you know about the homes there now, the homes were full and they were already old. It was just a typical neighborhood. I can't really, there wasn't anything that stood out per se, except that everybody knew everybody. And there were always, like my aunt and uncle lived a block away, and, my other aunt and uncle lived, maybe 5 or 6 blocks away. So there was always stuff going on in the neighborhood. And, I thought one time I was 6 years old and I went to the dentist, which was in Bexley. And we would always, and it was close enough when you're a kid, we could walk home from there. And so we would take the bus money and get an ice cream cone or something. And one day, a neighbor saw us, "What are you doing in Bexley?" And made us get in her car and take us home. And I guess she lived about 2 blocks from us, but she just knew who we were and wanted to know why we were all the way that far away from home.
Well, looking out for you, right?
Yep, and I think that's what it was.
Yeah.
And on Nelson Road there was a swimming pool, and the old ice house on Main Street at Nelson, wasn't Rhodes and High, or Rhodes and Main, was an ice house, and we would go up and knock on the chute and say, "Give us a piece of ice," and they'd shave some ice off, and it would come down the chute for us. So it was just kind of what you would hope to be like growing up.
Was your family still in the area when the freeway came through?
Yes. Matter of fact, that's when obviously things shifted. To mention my aunt and uncle who lived a block away, their house got destroyed and is now part of 70. The home I grew up in is still there, but it's like in the first block south of 70 where, it was Berkeley Road, and like if you're driving down the highway, you can see our old house from 70. But yeah, my aunt and uncle ended up moving out of the neighborhood. We eventually ended up moving to Bexley. And, I think, and it really dispersed the neighborhood all over. A lot of people ended up in the north area, up around Morris Road and 161. Other people went east to Reynoldsburg. So, it really caused a big exit. And part of it wasn't so much because the neighborhood was changing yet, but because half the people were dislodged and, had to find new housing. I was young enough that I don't remember it as, I probably remember it differently than the people who were going through it.
Right.
I remember it just as being everybody had to move. And so there wasn't a lot of energy behind it that I remember. But I'm sure my aunt and uncle had a lot of energy behind it when they had to dislodge and get out of the area. And
do you remember the construction? Were you young enough to play in the construction?
no, I don't remember the construction that actually, I think that by the time it got to the point where construction happened, we were already out of the neighborhood.
Okay.
Because, I don't remember, it was probably a couple years before houses started to get knocked down and dug up and everything. Because I remember when it was finished. That was been in the mid-'60s or late 60s. And I remember driving on 70, like within the first week of its opening. So I was 16 then, maybe 17. So that would have been 67.
Oh,
But we ended up moving out of Berkeley Road and that area somewhere in the early 60s, like 62, 63, somewhere in there.
okay.
Give or take, maybe a 64 odds, you know. So, and I don't think a lot of construction had started yet.
So how were you as a student?
Reasonable. I think I had a defiance. I was a little defiant. I was not easy. I was not an easy pupil. I was a good student. I wasn't an easy pupil. I challenged a lot, and so but I got reasonable grades. I was B student maybe, and I probably, looking back, was much more intelligent than my grades showed. I'm not boasting about that. It's just the reality is I know that I was an intelligent person, but I don't know that I was necessarily book smart. Just the way it was. High school was good. I went to Hartley High School. I was in the 10th grade graduating class from Bishop Hartley High School. That would have been 1969. And did well there. I was, like I mentioned, I was a little bit defiant, and so I wasn't always the most popular person, even with students. People were, I think I had respect, and people felt good about me, but I wasn't going to win class president, because I was just too willing to call people's crap. And, back then, that was the era also of Black is Beautiful. So they were beginning to get a shift in thinking around African Americans, Negroes then, and colored people. And there was this real shift towards being, towards recognizing, the inequalities. That was a good shift, in my opinion. And, I was aware of that, and I participated in that as much as I could at 18, 17 years old, and then high school. But I was aware of it, and I was very, and I think that's part of also what plays into my, I'm sure I knew I was gay then. I don't know if I had to put a finger on it, but I knew that, I had a reason to support people who are marginalized. In my head, marginalized wasn't a word I knew back then, but
You got the idea, though.
I got the idea. I knew what was going on, and I had friends who happened to be not white, happened to be Black, or not very many Latino at the time, but
When did you first become aware of gay as either a term or a thing that you could be? Does that make sense as a
Yeah, it
question?
does. I guess be aware of that's something I could be, probably was maybe even in college. But I was aware of liking boys early on. Probably 12, 13. But I wasn't being sexual at that time. I wasn't doing anything to identify on a sexual level. So, it was just, I liked boys. And they were more interesting to me than the girls. And so at that time, I didn't realize that was because of being gay, but I was aware of it. And, I can remember early on, this is what I consider one of my early gay memories, is I was at the Columbus airport waiting for my father to get off a plane. And back then you could go right to the gate. There wasn't anything holding you back. And, so we were standing at the gate and waiting for my father to get off the plane. And this man came off the plane who was very not large. He was muscular and he had earrings. And I just felt something go through me when I saw that man. Like, oh my God. And I can't remember how old I was, but I'm going to say I was 7 or 8, maybe 9. And then I can also remember being at Children's Hospital once, and I was there in the ER for some reason, and I even to this day have a memory of the doctor or the orderly or whatever it was leaning. It was probably the doctor leaning over me and just being like, "Oh wow, this man is cute." Mm-hmm. And I was 5 or 6, So I mean, but it wasn't at the time. I just knew that I felt a connection to that male person. Mm-hmm. And if I look at it there's probably. I mean, he was taking care of me. He was doing something to make me feel better. But but I had that sense that there was a connection there that wasn't what I think probably most boys felt when they were in that situation.
Right. When, since we're on the topic, when did you finally come out? What time?
Well, which time? I'm sure you probably hear that often. Mm-hmm. I came out in high school, I came out in college, and I finally came out for real when I was working at Ohio University. I think when I was in college, I can remember, as a freshman at the end of my freshman year, telling my friend who wanted to be my roommate the next year, I says, well, yeah, we can do that, but let's talk first. I want you to know some things about me. And of course, at that time, he was fine with it. He was straight, but I don't know why, but I just felt like I didn't want to room with someone who didn't know that about me. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't really out yet. But I was obviously out at some level. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't being intimate with anyone at that time to speak of. I mean, I had male-to-male contact, physical contact from time to time, but I really wasn't there yet knowing what was going on. As a matter of fact, we're talking 69, 70, and I remember not trying out for the chorus and the choir, which I was going to do because I was afraid people would think I was gay. Mm. And I did go for tryouts to become part of the theater groups and stuff, and I got freaked out. I couldn't, because of some of the guys there who were clearly, gay. I don't know what they were at the time, but, to me it was like, oh no, I can't do this. And so I never went back. Mm-hmm. And that was my obviously internal homophobia, but at the time it was really big. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I never pursued any kind of college theatrics or singing because I was afraid people would think I was gay. They probably already did. After I finished grad school, I ended up at Ohio University for my first job. And I worked as an administrator in the residence life and in the student affairs area. And I just can remember that at that time that would have been 1975, and there was a little bit more activity around lesbian and gay issues. And I went to there was a woman in town who was new to Athens also, and she wanted to. She was working on teaching. She wanted to do some seminars and stuff around gay issues, and her name was Jan Griesinger. She was at at United Campus Ministry there, and so I can what I remember is she and a couple other people, Ron Hunt, who was a professor at the university at the time, did a discussion for our student life, student affairs department. And at the end of it, I went up and started talking to him. And that was my first real coming out for real. Like, okay, this is real. This is who I am. And that started my coming out process. And it didn't end. I didn't go back in the closet. And I started coming out to my bosses, and actually the person I worked with, she and I were talking one day, and she says, a couple of the guys who, some of the students were wondering whether or not you were gay. And she goes, I told them, no, you're not gay. It's just that you have a real sense of compassion and being involved with people. And no, you're not gay. And I said, you better take that back. And so, so that was one, again, so I started coming out there, and from there, then I got involved with the March on Washington, the very first one. And actually prior to that, one of the things that had been going on at OU and at the United Campus Ministry was they were trying to get together a support group for people who happened to be gay. And they were calling it at the time the Gay People's Alliance. Again, there's some history there. I mean, at that time, that was the issue. It was the Gay People's Alliance. And it was kind of floundering, and nobody could seem to get it to get off the ground. So I thought, well, okay, let's see what we can do with this. And I started working with it and started trying to work on the support group and get the alliance going, and we were successful with that. And it grew. So finally, the Gay People's Alliance at Ohio University got off the ground. And that was before Ohio State had any gay groups, and actually, between us and Kent State, we were probably the first gay groups at any higher education location. And so we started doing seminars and stuff, and then that got going, and then from that, a few years later, the first March on Washington. So we started organizing people in universities to be involved in that. So I guess you could say I've been around since the beginning, almost the beginning, and been involved in making things happen in the gay world. Today, that group is called Open Doors. And it went through the obviously shifts it went from Gay People's Alliance to Gay and Lesbian People's Alliance, and then a couple other name changes, and then it became Open Doors. And it became more, I mentioned it was at United Campus Ministry, so it wasn't really a student organization in the sense that the university wasn't recognizing it. But eventually, the university began to recognize it and consider it a part of it, and then the students were able to get space in a university building, but the campus ministry is where it really started. And at that time, also, there was a push to get more inclusive, equal opportunity statements from different people, and myself and a couple of the other people from United Campus, Jan and Ron, that I mentioned before. We met with the university provost and the vice president of student affairs, and we were able to get them to include sexual orientation in their statements. And I think that was one of the first student organizations or universities that had sexual orientation and included in their handbooks and making things happen.
Good job.
Yep.
You went to Bishop Watterson. Was your family,
Hartley.
Hartley, Bishop Hartley. Was your family Catholic?
Yeah.
How did they take you coming out to them?
Well, I know that my brother was aware of it in high school, and I mean, he just did what a sibling would do. I mean, we were rivalries. Mm-hmm. He was a couple years younger, and he had a lot of cute friends around him, and I mean, he was aware of my, I guess, being different, a homo or whatever, and but I don't think any of the other family members that early caught on right away. Then my sister caught on when I was in college. I came home once and she told me, and she was already out of college. She was working here in Columbus, and she gave me the keys to her car and said, "You need to go downtown to the Cat's Meow or to whatever other place there was at the time." And she told me where they were and said, "I think you need to go to these places." So that would have been, I was probably under 21 at the time. So I was probably 19 or 20 when she did that. So, I mean, there are pockets of things that were fine. And most of my siblings were already gone. Many of them were already married when I came out. So when I finally did, they were all pretty much like, yeah. And I can remember, if you talk to my nephews or my grandnephews, every now and then they'll say something that, like, like, "Uncle Don, do you remember the time you did something?" And like, there was a guy who they were playing cards with once, and the guy who was not part of the family said, "Oh, that's so gay." And I stopped him and I said, "Wait a minute." And I was firm with him. And the little nephews, they were 13, 12, 14, grandnephews, my nephew and niece's children, remember that. And now, the regular nephews and nieces, I don't know if I was around them enough in that period for them to get a thought one way. They knew. I don't think that any of my family members hid it from their kids. Some, it just came naturally that, oh yeah, he is. And others, I think, figured it out for themselves and would then ask mom and dad, "What about Uncle Don?" And so I guess there was always a level of, but then again, my mother was like, "I'm glad you waited because now your father can't hold it against you," and because I was already working and I was, at Ohio University and had my own income and everything. And my parents were wealthy enough and I was privileged enough that they paid for my education all the way through. They paid for my college. They paid for my grad school. I had scholarships and things, so it wasn't like a lot of money, but they supported me through that. And, we're talking early late 60s, early 70s, where you went to college for $5,000 for 4 years. Or, $5,000 a year was about the most it cost versus the huge amounts today, which probably comparably speaking weren't that much different.
Right.
But still, I mean, I went to private schools and private universities, and my grad school was, I didn't pay for my grad school. I was a free ride because of scholarships, and I worked at the college and whatnot.
What did you go to school for?
Undergrad was political science. I thought I'd be an attorney, but I found that I didn't want to be an attorney. I just wasn't the right fit. I wasn't adversary in that way. I was adversary, but not in that way. I was more of a supportive nature, and I wanted to help and encourage people, not take care of them after they got in trouble. If they were in trouble, I'd want to do it because the trouble wasn't legal. So then I went into psychology and guidance and counseling for my grad programs. And so then eventually I graduated and worked in student affairs, because it was an easy shift because I was already working in student affairs while in grad school. And then from there, began to focus more on counseling and psychotherapy. So I was political science, and then for grad school it was guidance and counseling, which today they'd probably call it clinical counseling, or the names would have changed a bit.
Mm-hmm. So after grad school, you then had the job at OU.
Right.
And then did you come directly from OU back to Columbus?
No.
Or?
When I finished at OU, I worked at OU for about 4 years, maybe 5. Those kind of things I was there from around 1975 to 1980. And then I took a couple years. I was not sure what I wanted to do, but I knew that I was finished at the university for a lot of different reasons. And, university politics are pretty weird. And so I just took a year off. And I just, pretty much what I did is organize around the March on Washington locally, not nationally. And that's the year I took off. It was just to work on gay stuff and help the Gay People's Alliance continue to flourish, and to get a little bit more active in allowing access, even in bars. There was no gay bar in Athens, but we made one, at least a couple nights a week. And there was resistance there from bar owners, but they were okay with it at some level. Well, I had been at the university, working at the university, and I'm the type of, my personality lends it to letting people feel comfortable with me. And so I had a lot of the students really, really, I connected with them. They liked me, and they found me as someone that they could connect with, and respect. And when I came out, it was a shock to most of them. And I would get through the grapevine, they were talking about you last night. They were just like, really? Him? Why did I like him so much? So, and a couple of those guys were managers at some of the bars in town. So we would meet, the Gay People's Alliance would meet, and then at the end of the meeting, we'd all gravitate to somewhere. And there was one bar in particular that those guys who I knew managed. So we would go there. And it was a good place. I can't remember the name. And we would dance. They would be fine with it. And then there came to a point where they literally, the owners of the bar and the managers came and said, we can't let you do this anymore. We're losing business. So what I said, we didn't start a gay bar, but what we did is we would organize and go to the same bar, and we would be okay dancing and being, but eventually it turned out okay. The owners of the bar said, look, we need to figure out how to make this work because it's not working for us. Mm-hmm. And if you guys come and you're clearly dancing together and you're being who you are together. I don't know if those are the words they used, but we're not going to be able to survive because there's not enough of you to make it work. It wasn't so much that they were anti-gay or homophobic any more than, someone who didn't know much would be. It's that they felt that if they allowed the gay community to come to their bars and be okay with that, they weren't going to survive. Mm. And it was probably true. So they asked us, slow down. Let's make it, come when you can, but don't be so clearly obvious because we can't survive on just you guys. We need to have a base of clientele that is going to keep our bar open. Mm.
Well, you mentioned the Cat's Meow in Columbus.
Yep.
Was that?
I think that was the first gay bar I ever went into. Yeah. Well, yeah, it was the first gay bar I ever went into.
What was that place like?
I don't remember, other than the fact that it was there. I mean, it was a quaint spot because of the shape of it, and it was typical of any bar at that time. It was secluded, and one of the things I can remember my sister asking me once, she goes, "Is that bar on Long Street, or is that a gay bar? The one by the Metropolitan Club?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." She goes, "I thought so. There's no windows." Mm. She goes, "I could tell that it was a bar, and I could see people coming in and out because her office was near there. But there were no windows." Mm-hmm. And so I figured it had to be a gay bar. Mm. And it was Trends the Garage. Mm. And I don't remember Cat's Meow having any exposed windows, anything where you could see into the building. And, the other gay bars were pretty much the same way, is that you didn't allow yourself to be visible. Mm. So they were clandestine and hidden in a lot of ways. Yeah. I mean, Cat's Meow was famous for being a gay bar. I can remember in high school people jokingly talking about, "Oh, where'd you go last night? The Cat's Meow?" And at that time, I had never seen it or been there. I walked by it in a St. Patrick's Day parade once. But, yeah, I mean, I can remember my first time there in that bar. And it was that night when my sister gave me her car and said, "You need to check these places out." Mm-hmm. But I don't think I was old enough to drink yet. Or I was just 21. I don't think I was 21 yet. So the best I could do was have a 3-2 beer.
I guess it's better than nothing.
Right. And I did talk to people there, and I went back again. And but I was not living in Columbus full time then. I was in college. And I went to school in New York. So And so that kind of stuff is what I did that year that I wasn't working. And then I found a position in Marietta, Ohio. And I was director of what was known as Friends Incorporated, which was the crisis hotline and the drug rehab center or drug counseling center. Back then, alcohol and drug were separate programs. And the alcohol people and the drug people were very separate. On the state level, on the federal level, your funding came from different locations and everything. So I was just drugs, not alcohol. And, I had the degrees for being able to do counseling and therapy, and at the time also there wasn't a lot of regulation around that. So we started that, and I worked at Friends, the crisis center, for several years. I was in Marietta for, I think, about a total of 10 years. And there was transition at that time. I became certified in drug counseling, and eventually that certification turned into an alcohol and drug certification, and then a license. And so at the beginning, it was a certification because there wasn't a such thing as a license for doing therapy with alcohol and drug or even mental health. And the psychology license was just brand new, and so it was just all that type of regulation was just getting started. So I kept up with what I was doing, and I started a gay group in Marietta, which came with a lot of resistance. When I got hired, one of the board members said, well, we're taking a chance hiring you. It's not going to be seen very favorable in some situations, but we're going to do it anyway. And that what they were taught, I had a history at that point of being out, and I didn't want a job. When I went to interviews, I said, look, this is who I am, and this is what I'm about. And if you all can't handle that, or if you all are going to create issues for me because of that, then I don't want your job. Mm-hmm. And this would have been 1980. Friends in Marietta hired me, and eventually Friends merged into the mental health center. Mm-hmm. When drug and alcohol started to get merged on funding levels, then we merged with the mental health center, and I became the coordinator or the head of the department for crisis intervention. And there was already an alcohol person there, so she was the director of the alcohol and drug programs. But I pretty much worked in that plus the crisis intervention. I'd spent a lot of time in the emergency rooms talking to people. So that's sort of my history as far as, and back then we continued to have the gay groups, and Marietta College was there. So a lot of the people who came it was at my home. It wasn't connected to the mental health center. Once a week, my home was full of late teen and early 20s people hanging out as a gay group in Marietta, Ohio. And, politics-wise, it wasn't an easy thing. And I didn't suffer specifically, but, there was a lot of hassle with people who were on the 648 board, which was the to the Atom boards. They didn't like me. They didn't like what I was representing. Mm-hmm. And they made it known. And at some point, they tried to defund me for it. I was on WOSU, not WOSU, the one, it was the Ohio University PBS station. Can't remember what the call numbers were. And they were doing a show on being gay. And some of the typical people showed up. And, there were other people who were involved in the organization of beginning of Gay People's Alliance, George, Spence, several others. And so we were doing a TV section about, growing up gay and all this. And I was living in Marietta at the time, so I was no longer in Athens. And when I got back from that, my board's phones were ringing like mad with, how did you let him do that? We can't believe you let him go on TV like that. As if they had a choice, And even there was a psychologist a doctor on the 648 board who I thought would have been an ally, and she turned out not to be an ally. And she pretty much looked at me and said, it's okay if you're gay, but don't you dare ever do that again. And she was not happy with the fact that I went on TV and talked about it. And so, I dealt with a lot of that down there. And, but obviously I was a strong person in many ways. And so I also was able to handle it for me. But it created a lot of difficulties for the organization at some point. And also at that time, I started drinking more, and I eventually realized, I was the director of a drug program, and I was also at the time a not recovering alcoholic. So I got that taken care of back then too. I eventually realized it was just not going to work. And I went into treatment back in 1983. Back in that time, 81, 82, HIV/AIDS was beginning to become more obvious. And people started paying a little bit of attention to it. And the task forces around the country were starting, and we started a task force down in Washington County. And so I started, I was trained as a HIV notifier, like if somebody had a positive test, then in that county, I was the one who got to go let them know about it and to talk to them about it. And so at this point, it would have been 1984 because I know I was already sober when I was doing that. At the time, on a political level, politics were such that the drug and alcohol programs and the alcohol program and the drug programs were going to get merged at even a greater level than they had been. And I kept thinking, well, there's a good chance that I'm not, they're going to have more people than they need. And although my job was somewhat secure, I just could think, it's possible that I could be one of the ones who doesn't, who gets laid off because they've merged all these programs at the federal level and at the state level and then at the county levels. But before that, I was thinking it was about time. I had gotten a notice of the first meeting. Actually, it was probably the second. It was the first annual meeting. It wasn't the first meeting of the Ohio AIDS Coalition. Mm-hmm. And I had seen stuff about them before, and I thought, maybe I should go to these meetings. So I ended up going up to the meeting. And there were people there from all over the state: Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, Kent. And in the process of that meeting, I got elected the treasurer of the organization. It was my first time in the room. And it was an attorney from Cincinnati. They were talking about some stuff. And since I was at that point the executive director of a program in Marietta, I already had funding knowledge, and I had the knowledge of how to do that work. And so they were talking about needing this and needing that, and I had the answers. I said, well, this is what you need to do, and if you need a 501c3, this is the process. It's not as hard as people think it is. It's just something that And so this attorney from Cincinnati goes, I don't know that guy's name, but I think he'd make a good treasurer. And then Rhonda Rivera goes, yeah, I think he would too. And then that's how I became treasurer of the Ohio AIDS Coalition. So I was still down in Marietta, and I was still working at that time at the mental health center. My organization had merged with the mental health center, and I was just thinking I needed to think about what's next. And on a side story, every time when I got in trouble with the 648 board, every time I got in trouble for being gay in my professional life, I found a new job that paid me more. And it was just like, it was like, okay, I'm making X, and then I found a new job and I got a really nice increase. And then I found a new job and doubled my salary because I think it was karma. And, the universe taking care of me in the sense that when these things would happen, and I knew that part of it, like when we merged with the mental health center, part of that was because they didn't want to fund the faggot. And that was pretty obvious if you were at the meetings. And that the guys who were homophobes were stronger on the board than the ones who weren't. So they literally almost defunded my organization because of that. But what happened was, as a way of keeping that from happening, we merged with the mental health center, and I doubled my salary when that happened.
It's a nice little bonus.
Yes, it was, and I think I already had my certifications by that time, and then so while there also the mental health side of licensure began. And I was able to grandfather into my licensed professional clinical counseling area. So anyway, back to how I ended up in Columbus. I had all that going on, and I had cut out a tiny little help wanted ad and stuck it in my desk drawer. And the job was in Columbus. And I was cleaning out my desk one day and I found it. I thought, yeah, right, this job's not going to be available. But it was like a job where they needed both a person who was certified in drugs and also a person who was licensed in mental health. And I fortunately had both. And that was rare at that time. It was rare to find somebody who was had a specialty in SAMI, substance abuse and mentally ill. So I thought, well, I'm just going to go ahead and send off a letter to this guy and say, hey, I'm down in Marietta. I'm thinking about looking for a new job, and I, cut this out and never responded to it. So I just thought, hey, if you got a job opening that you think I might be qualified for, let me know. And I sent him my resume. And 2 days later, I get a phone call saying, we've never filled that job. So I talked to the medical director of the counseling center and said, hey, I'm going to go look at this job. I'm just telling you because you might get a phone call or something, and I don't want it to be a surprise, but I'm really not, I was director of a department at the mental health center. So I wasn't, so I'm really not looking for a new job. I'm happy here, but I just thought I'd check it out and see what it's about. It was a job where I would be an assessor. I wasn't doing therapy. I would be working in all the different mental health and locations in the Franklin County, doing evaluations and assessments. And I thought, that sounds fun. So I got offered the job. And then I called I was back on the Ohio AIDS Coalition. I was still on the board. And the president of the board was Howard Fradkin. And we had become friends by then. I had been working now for about 5 years, plus or minus, as on the Ohio AIDS Coalition board. And so I called Howard and said, what do you know about this net care place? And what do you know about this guy, Tom Fuller, who was the guy looking to hire me? And he told me, oh yeah, I used to work with him, and it's a good place, this, blah, blah. And then he goes, why? I says, well, they've offered me a job, and I'm thinking about taking it. And Howard says, well, I didn't know you wanted to come back to Columbus. I said, well, yeah, I've been thinking about it because, things are happening on a level that I think it's probably a good idea for me to start looking for new work. He goes, well, why don't you come work with us at Affirmations? And I thought, oh, I never even thought about that. So Affirmations was a private counseling center, Affirmations Center for Psychotherapy and Growth. And I thought, oh, great. So now I got 2 jobs in Columbus. So I came. And the nice thing about the net care job was it was in the community assessment program, and I wasn't doing therapy there. So I wasn't in any conflict by going to a private practice, a couple of days a week and doing therapy. And then after my practice got big enough, I left net care and just went full-time at Affirmations and became one of the owners.
What was Affirmations' focus when you started there?
Well, Affirmations was always a gay-owned, gay-operated counseling center, psychotherapy center. And it catered to lesbian, bi, gay folk. And it was known for that, that it was. And so, and I guess, and I had already been doing that in Athens and in Marietta, in Marietta at the mental health center, but in Athens privately. And so it was one of the things I intended or planned on wanting to do. So it was it was a good fit. And it's also, at that time, we were in the Ohio AIDS Coalition, and so it was probably one of the main places for people with HIV and AIDS to come for therapy.
And what were the most common, I don't know what you call it, therapy issues that people were bringing? Were there themes or kind of large things that were going on?
I think it was pretty much the same as any other location, except that you had the lesbian and gay and bisexual piece to it. A lot of people came because they were coming out, and that was confusing, and they just needed to figure all that out. And then, we worked with, my specialty was substance abusing mentally ill, and also drug and alcohol. I had my drug license, I had my alcohol license, and I had my mental health license. So, that's where my focus was. And so actually we had groups going on at the time, different groups, and so it was pretty much general mental health issues, depression, anxiety, life stresses, so not much different than you'd find anywhere else, except that it was a very open and accepting location, and people knew that, and people came there because of that. A matter of fact, people who were out, I guess you could say allies today, would be that come in. And I had more than once a client come in and go, well, I don't know if I'm in the right place because I'm not lesbian or I'm not gay, but I figured if you guys were open and willing to handle those kind of issues, you'll be able to handle my issues just fine. Mm-hmm. So, so we had the reputation, and just dealt with everything. And we always joked that there was a sign on the front of the building and that said, if you've had treatment failures, if you've never been able to find a counselor who was able to help you with your situation, this is the place for you. And even though it was not a visible sign, people seemed to find it. So we dealt with a lot of really difficult mental health issues, where people have had several treatment failures and people just weren't being able to connect with their therapist. And we were successful with that. Can't say why. I guess it's all about the fact that we were open to the possibilities for people. And I always had the idea that when a person walks into my office, I'm there to learn from, they are there to teach me something. So I think in that sense, what happens is your therapy situation becomes more collaborative and less the doctor taking care of you. And so I think that made a big, and I think that was the atmosphere in our office was, we're here to assist you because you're going to assist us. Of course, we got paid for it, but that's just a side. I mean, that's what you did for a profession. Mm-hmm. But I think really I think that attitude and that inclusiveness made it more likely that people were going to find healthy therapeutic relationships at Affirmations. Mm-hmm. And we ended up with a statewide and international reputation. Mm-hmm. And the story, which you might keep, it might not, but my sister-in-law was working in a hospital in Dayton, and she was in her office one day, and a woman came in, and they were talking about stuff, and the woman said something about the woman that was in the office was a social worker counselor, and she started talking, and she goes about coming to Columbus for something, and she goes, "Oh, my brother-in-law is in Columbus, and he works there as a therapist, and well, what's his name?" And she goes, "Oh, you wouldn't know him." And she goes, "Well, I don't know. I know a lot of people in the field in Columbus." And she goes, "Well," she told me, "it's Don Laufersweiler," and he's Don Laufersweiler, Howard, Kate, and then she just started going off about how, it's like the premier counseling center in the state, and how people, wish they could work there. And this was happening. She was talking to someone in Dayton. So about an hour later, I got a phone call from my sister-in-law. "You wouldn't believe what just happened." So, I mean, I think there was a reputation that that we were really what we said we were.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also part of that was the work we were doing in HIV. We had the gay men. We started, before I got there, they had started through the Columbus AIDS Taskforce a HIV support group. Mm-hmm. And they would meet at Affirmations once a week. And this was back when the chances of surviving were very minimal. And again, the support group started to dwindle just because people were dying. Mm-hmm. And I can remember, and then I started working with Howard in that group. And we had already been working with one of the things that the Ohio AIDS Coalition did was healing weekends around the state. So, and we'd already been doing those before I even came to Affirmations. And so that the people in the support group started to diminish, and it got down to where it was the same two people, and that was all. And then it got down to one person. And I can remember saying to that person, keep coming back. People will be here. But it was the reason it dwindled wasn't because people weren't getting something from the group. It said several had died and others were just like, oh, I can't go back. It was a grief issue. It was they were dealing with all their friends that they didn't have anymore, who usually were there on Monday nights. Mm-hmm. And so, but eventually, I can remember telling the person, keep coming. Don't, just keep coming, because people will start showing up. And they did. And then the gay men support, or the HIV support group, got up to where we had to close on Monday nights because the whole building was used for the support group. We would have 3 different therapists working in the support group, and we would all meet in one room at the beginning, crowd into one room and say hello to everyone, and then we were separated into 3 different groups. Mm-hmm. And we used up the whole office. And I think, that was really important. Mm-hmm. And another reason why people knew that, why we were successful.
Mm-hmm. Does that group still exist?
No. Well, there's probably some semblance of it, at different levels. But one of the things that happened was people started getting healthier because of the new drugs and the protease inhibitors, and as that happened, they all started going. The face of HIV shifted a bit, where people were going back to work. They weren't going on disability at the same level or as early, and so the need of the group shifted. And it kept going. I mean, there was still a reason for having it, mm-hmm. but the reasons were not as extreme. Mm. And the group started to slowly get smaller, and eventually it got to where we, only needed one room again. And it was good. It would be pretty much the same people every week, which was fine, because they were the ones who identified a need and wanted to be there. And occasionally, usually if The good thing about keeping the group going was there would always be a new diagnosis. Somebody would come in with, just being diagnosed. And so there was this group of people who could help them through that. And then eventually the need wasn't as great. And so probably around in the 2000s, we stopped the group.
Yeah.
Probably around, and it was a decision of the group members that, I just said, okay, guys, the same 6 people are showing up every week. You're all pretty healthy. You're all doing well. Do you want to keep doing this? And so for the next 6 weeks or so, they had a discussion about, do we want to keep doing this? And the conclusion came to, well, I only come because you come. Well, I only come because you come. And so it came to the conclusion was, I think we're done. We don't need to do this anymore. And that was somewhere in around 2005, 2010.
Thank you for talking about that. Another thing I wanted to ask you about was one of the videos that I've previously worked on was with trans people and issues regarding them. And this video is from the 90s.
Right.
But they mentioned your group as being very helpful. I can't remember the person's name, but them working with you through their issues was people dealing with their sexual identity with the idea that they would eventually transition. Was that always something you dealt with, or was that something that...
That is something I've always dealt with. As a matter of fact, this is a story that, let's go back to Marietta. In my private work in Marietta, not in the mental health, so it was probably before the merger of the two centers. I had a small private practice, and one day a person came into my office and had indicated that they were dealing with trans issues. And they are sitting there, and we're talking. I go, well, what makes you feel like you need to be a man? And they looked at me kind of strangely. And said, well, I already am a man. I want to transition to a woman. But this person had already started that process, and that she was dressing, for the most part, as a woman, although she had never done anything on a therapy level to speak of, or on a way to make that happen, other than the fact that she had always, on a dress level, on a visual level, already transitioned. And wasn't gainfully employed because of it, and had issues around that whole thing. And this was in Marietta in the mid-'80s. And I think that was the first time I worked with someone who was transgendered. Were clearly transgendered. And we worked together, and I helped her find resources, and she started coming up to Ohio State to Columbus with Merle Crane, to the support groups that were around trans issues and cross-dressing and things of that sort at that time. I think cross-dressing is a pretty archaic term now. But I like to use the terms that were going on at the time, because I think it put perspective on, when I mentioned earlier about black, and black is beautiful, and colored people and Negroes. I think there's a transition that occurs. And so knowing the history and putting those terms to the history as opposed to trying to be politically correct about all that helps figure it all out. Helps you see the progression. And so she progressed, and eventually that person sent me a letter saying I moved to France and I had operations, and I'm back in the States now, and it happened. So when I got to Columbus, I already had, she wasn't the only one, but she was the first, and might have been the person you were talking to. I don't know. And so when I hit Columbus, I was already aware, and I was working with people. And so, and again, it's a network. The people find you through their network. Oh yeah, I hear so and so at Affirmations, or well, first off, it might be, oh, Affirmations will be fine with. You don't need to worry about hiding, and then it might come, oh well, so and so there already sees some people and he knows what it's all about. He knows the ins and outs, so he might be a good person for you to talk to. And again, I mean, it's the issue isn't my issue. It's I'm not there to determine what a person wants to think. I'm there to help a person figure that out and to do their own transitioning, both on a spiritual level and on a physical level and on a emotional level. So I don't always have to understand the situation to help someone figure it out for themselves. Mm-hmm. It's better if I do it, I guess, at some level. But, it's not always necessary. I probably a dozen or so trans folk came through in my office that I worked with and helped get to points where on both directions, male to female and female to male. The more I talk about it, the more names that come into my head that were there and that I worked with.
Do you think the issues people that we're dealing with, specifically LGBTQ issues, did they change over time as we've become more accepting and more open? Or is it just, people dealing with issues that people deal with?
A little bit of both. I think one of the biggest issues for people who happen to be in the spectrum of sexuality is acceptance of their own acceptance of that. Mm-hmm. So, dealing with a lot of internal homophobia, not what's coming from the outside, but what's coming from the inside. If you've been told there's something wrong with you all your life, or if you've seen in media and in general public that there's something wrong with you, you internalize that. It becomes part of you, and if you want to make it different, you have to deal with all those tapes that you have to unwind and erase, and recognize that it's not the truth. I'm not a bad person. There's nothing wrong with me. So I think a lot of coming out is about dealing with your own internal issues, not external issues. And even the internal issue of not thinking you will be accepted. It's like nobody's going to talk to me. Nobody's going to want to be around me if they knew this about me. And made me think of a time when I was at a conference and there was a group of people sitting around the table, and one of the women said, well, there's, it was, the women were talking about not having confidence in finding men who are supportive and who can really get it. And one of the women, it says, she goes, well, I only know 2 straight men who I would put in a category of being correct in a feminist way, and that would be Greg and Don. And Greg and I looked at Greg and he looked at me, and we just went, ha ha. And one of the women in the group just kind of looked at us and thought, oh yeah, right. Because they were talking about straight men. And I guess at that time I wasn't out yet. So I was at a level. But because I was already at OU. So yeah, so it was just so funny that, the two men that she picked out as examples of how straight men should be were 2 gay men. And of course, 2 educated and knowledgeable gay men. Because I think that, one of the unfortunate things about internalized homophobia is you turn it towards other gay people. You don't turn it towards straight people or other bi people.
You've done a lot of work to help people over the years. What is the thing you're most proud of having done?
Well, as far as professionally going, I don't know if I could single out one thing, but I would have to go back to the HIV/AIDS work and being there during all that. And actually, you talk about karma and right place, right time. I had the specialties to fall right into that. Because I had the drug and alcohol background and I had the mental health background and dealing with severe issues. And, like people with HIV have addiction issues. People with HIV have other health issues. And so I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to be able to do that.
Did you ever work with the Pater Nostra house in town?
A little, but I wasn't really involved with them very much. Their people who lived there came to the support groups and came to Affirmations for counseling. Mm-hmm. But I didn't have a whole lot to do with Pater Nostra at all. And I'm thinking it was already. I'm thinking when I came to Columbus in 1990, I think it was already its predecessor were already in place. Mm-hmm. And you just one of those things you have to do is you have to choose where you can be, and so it was just simply Pater Nostra was an important spot, mm-hmm. and I did work with people who were there, several, but I just never got involved with that organization, that group. CATF and OAC, Ohio AIDS Coalition, was where I put my efforts. And I think because of the Ohio AIDS Coalition, the people who volunteered with that, you could almost say that I probably had contact, and the group had contact with probably 90% of the people in the state of Ohio who had HIV through the coalition and through the healing weekends that we conducted. And I mean, I Cleveland, Cincinnati, Toledo, Sandusky. If you were in the 90s, if you had HIV in those areas, anywhere in the state, Youngstown, Marietta, Athens, you probably had contact with the Ohio AIDS Coalition and the volunteers, therapists that were involved with that.